The hum of morning filled the air like a low symphony inside Larkwell Industries' downtown tower. It was the kind of building where glass gleamed so sharply it cut the skyline, where men and women in pressed suits hustled through revolving doors, clutching laptops and ambition. The marble lobby echoed with footsteps, the clipped sound of heels and the murmur of conversations in English, occasionally punctuated with laughter or the clink of coffee cups. It was an ordinary Tuesday, but for one man, it was about to become unforgettable. Jonathan Raines, CEO of Larkwell, walked briskly from the garage elevator to the central lobby. He carried his usual air of focus, shoulders squared, jaw tight, mind already running through a checklist of quarterly reports, overseas clients, and an upcoming board review. He wasn't a man who noticed much beyond numbers and deadlines anymore. Not the lobby art, not the security guards, and certainly not the janitors who moved like shadows along the walls, pushing carts with sprays and cloths. Until today, before we go any further, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us till the very end. And if the story moves you, drop your thoughts in the comments and share it with a friend. Now let's begin. Jonathan's stride slowed, not because of a phone call or a sudden thought, but because of a sound, a voice clear, sharp, and oddly melodic. It rose above the murmur of the lobby like a silver thread woven into heavy cloth. The words weren't English. They weren't even close. They were rolling, lyrical, and unmistakably fluent in Mandarin. Jonathan froze, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't heard Mandarin spoken that effortlessly since his last business trip to Beijing. He turned his head, expecting to see a visiting partner or perhaps one of the firm's international consultants who occasionally flew in. But what he saw instead made his breath catch. Near the side of the lobby, by the directory kiosk, stood a man in a faded navy jumpsuit, a janitor's badge clipped to his chest. He was speaking rapidly, confidently, his hands moving with the easy gestures of someone who wasn't just mimicking words but owning them. The man was helping a confused visitor, an elderly gentleman clutching paperwork in Chinese characters, navigate the building. Jonathan blinked once, twice. He recognized the janitor. He'd seen him in passing, late evenings, emptying bins in the executive wing, quietly polishing brass railings, always nodding politely but never speaking unless spoken to. Jonathan didn't know his name. He didn't think he'd ever bothered to ask. Yet here he was, carrying on a full conversation in Mandarin as though it were his mother tongue. Jonathan stepped closer, curiosity tugging him. Just as he did, the janitor finished with the elderly visitor, who left smiling in relief. Then, without pause, the janitor turned to another man, this one a delivery worker with a clipboard and an apologetic look. And suddenly his voice shifted. Spanish now, smooth, natural, rolling off his tongue like he'd lived it all his life. Jonathan's brows lifted. The delivery worker grinned, said gracias, and moved on. And then, before Jonathan could even digest that, another switch. A young woman in a tailored dress was peering anxiously at a set of misdelivered packages. The janitor approached her and spoke in French, warm and precise. Her eyes lit with recognition. He gestured toward the correct conference hall, guiding her with a faint smile. Jonathan's pulse quickened. 3 languages, 3 flawless performances. For the first time in years, Jonathan Raines, CEO, master of boardrooms, a man who believed he'd seen just about everything, stood still in the middle of his own lobby, stunned. Jonathan's mind spun as he followed the janitor with his eyes. The man had already returned to his cart, quietly tucking a rag into his belt, as if he hadn't just unlocked a secret world in plain sight. People passed by him without noticing. Some even sidestepped him impatiently, as though his presence was an inconvenience. Yet Jonathan couldn't look away. He approached. His leather shoes clicked across the marble floor until he stood just a few feet away. "You," Jonathan said, his tone sharper than intended. The janitor looked up. His eyes, deep brown, calm with a hint of wary intelligence, met Jonathan's. "Sir?" His English was soft, accented but clear. Jonathan tilted his head, studying him. "What's your name?" "David," the janitor replied, his hand tightening slightly on the cart handle. "David," Jonathan echoed, testing the word as if it might unlock something further. He gestured vaguely. Those languages, Mandarin, Spanish, French. You spoke them perfectly. David shrugged, lowering his gaze. Just helping. Helping? Jonathan pressed, his voice quieter now, edged with disbelief. Where did you learn to do that? For a long moment, David didn't answer. His silence wasn't the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of someone measuring what to reveal. Around them, the lobby churned on with the rhythm of the morning rush. Phones rang, elevators chimed, conversations rose and fell. Yet between Jonathan and David, a pocket of stillness hung heavy. Finally, David said, "Life teaches you things if you listen hard enough." His voice carried a weight Jonathan couldn't quite place. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. He was used to employees stumbling over themselves when the CEO spoke to them. But David didn't stumble. He didn't grovel. He stood steady, neither arrogant nor submissive, just rooted. Do you know how rare it is for someone to master even one foreign language fluently? Jonathan asked, almost as if he were challenging him. Let alone 3, or more, I assume. David's lips curved slightly. Not a smile, not exactly, but something close. Languages are keys. I picked up a few, enough to unlock doors when I needed them. Jonathan felt an unexpected chill. There was a story here, a deep one. The way David said it, like each language was a survival tool, not a hobby, stirred something in Jonathan's chest, something he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to ask more. He wanted to demand answers. But just then, a voice broke through the moment. Mr. Rains, it was Patricia, his assistant, hurrying across the lobby with her tablet in hand. The boardroom is ready for you. They're waiting upstairs. Jonathan turned, irritation flickering across his face. For the first time, the board felt irrelevant. He looked back at David, but the janitor had already moved, pushing his cart toward the far hallway, melting into the stream of people like a shadow retreating before the sun. Jonathan stood frozen, watching him disappear. He couldn't explain why his chest tightened, or why he felt as though he'd just witnessed something extraordinary, something that didn't belong in the quiet anonymity of a janitor's uniform. Sir? Patricia prodded gently. The boardroom. Jonathan inhaled sharply, collecting himself. He straightened his tie, his expression hardening back into the mask of the CEO. Yet deep inside, the mask had cracked. The image of David's calm, knowing eyes refused to leave his mind. As he stepped into the elevator, Jonathan thought to himself, who are you, really? The boardroom stretched before Jonathan like a battlefield of polished mahogany and stern faces. Men and women in dark suits arranged their documents, sipping coffee, waiting for the meeting to begin. The skyline loomed beyond the glass walls. But Jonathan's focus wasn't on profit margins or projections today. His mind kept circling back to the lobby, to David, to those languages spoken so fluidly they rattled the certainty of his world. As the CFO droned on about overseas expansion, Jonathan's thoughts drifted. He replayed David's words in his head. Languages are keys, enough to unlock doors when I needed them. The phrasing wasn't casual. It carried the sharp edges of experience. But experience from where? How did a janitor of all people end up speaking with the skill of a diplomat? Mr. Rains? The CFO's voice snapped Jonathan back. Do you agree with the proposal? Jonathan blinked, straightened, and nodded curtly. We'll review the figures later. His tone silenced further questions. The rest of the meeting dragged. But Jonathan's eyes kept darting to the windows, his fingers tapping against the table, restless. The mask of composure held, but beneath it, curiosity burned. By the time the meeting adjourned, his decision was made. He needed answers. That evening, long after the last of the staff had trickled out and the offices had gone quiet, Jonathan lingered on the top floor. The nightlights of the city spread beneath him, a glowing map of lives he would never touch. Yet somewhere in the building below, David was still working, cleaning, sweeping, silent. Jonathan loosened his tie, took the private elevator down, and stepped into the deserted halls. The hum of vacuum cleaners echoed faintly, the smell of disinfectant sharp in the air. And there he was, David, bent over, polishing the brass handles of the conference doors. His movements were precise, almost meditative. Jonathan approached slowly. David. The janitor looked up, startled for a moment, then straightened. Mr. Rains. Jonathan folded his arms. I want to talk. David studied him, unreadable, then nodded. Talk, then. Jonathan hesitated. He wasn't used to being the one asking questions. His voice softened, stripped of authority. Where did you learn? Mandarin, Spanish, French. You didn't pick those up in night classes, not like that. David wiped his hands on a cloth, eyes flicking briefly toward the darkened windows. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, I didn't learn them here. I learned them when I had no choice. Jonathan tilted his head. No choice? David's gaze grew distant. When you grow up moving from country to country, when your family has nothing, but survival depends on being understood, you learn. First for yourself, then for the people you love. Jonathan's chest tightened. There was pain beneath the calm, loss hidden in the careful way David spoke. And yet, there was also strength, a resilience that Jonathan, for all his wealth, felt he had never truly known. You could be anywhere with those skills, Jonathan said quietly. Why here? Why pushing a cart in my building? David's eyes met his. There it was again, that unshakable steadiness, that depth. Because sometimes, Mr. Rains, the world doesn't care what you can do. It only cares what you look like when you walk into a room. The words hit Jonathan like a blow. He had no response. For once, the CEO, the man who always had an answer, stood speechless. And in that silence, Jonathan realized something unsettling. Maybe this janitor wasn't just unlocking doors for lost visitors. Maybe he was unlocking something inside Jonathan himself. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in his penthouse apartment, the city's glow spilling through the tall windows, replaying David's words again and again. The world doesn't care what you can do. It only cares what you look like when you walk into a room. For years, Jonathan had lived in boardrooms where suits and titles dictated worth. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be underestimated, dismissed. Yet somehow, David's quiet truth stirred something buried in him. A memory of a younger Jonathan, a hungry man from a modest background, fighting to be heard among men born into wealth. Somewhere along the way, he had crossed the line. He had become one of them. The very people who never looked twice at men like David. By morning, the decision was made. He couldn't let this go. When Jonathan arrived at the office, he scanned the lobby until he found him. David was mopping the far corner, head bent, as invisible to the crowd as ever. Jonathan walked straight toward him. Come with me, Jonathan said. David frowned, hand tightening on the mop. Sir? I said come with me, now. There was no arrogance in Jonathan's tone, only urgency. After a pause, David set the mop aside and followed. The two men entered the private elevator, rising through floors that gleamed with wealth. Employees glanced up as the CEO passed with the janitor at his side, confusion flickering in their eyes. In Jonathan's office, floor-to-ceiling glass washed the room with daylight. David stood by the window, shoulders squared, as Jonathan circled behind his desk. You don't belong on a cleaning crew, Jonathan said, his voice firm, decisive. You belong in rooms where your mind, your knowledge, your languages matter. Tell me what you're hiding, David. What's your story? Silence filled the room. David didn't rush. He took a slow breath, his gaze fixed on the city beyond the glass, as though weighing whether to open doors long kept locked. Finally, he turned. You want the truth, Mr. Rains? I was once exactly what you just described, in other rooms, in other countries. I translated for officials, negotiated deals. I was respected. His jaw tightened. Until one mistake cost me everything. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong people. I lost the job, lost the trust, and when you fall, the world doesn't catch you. It lets you land wherever you land. For me, it was here, with a mop. Jonathan felt his throat dry. There was no self-pity in David's voice, only fact. A man who had endured his fall and carried it quietly. Why not try again? Jonathan asked, leaning forward. With your ability, you could rebuild. Start over. David's eyes met his, steady, unflinching. Because doors don't open twice for men like me. People see the uniform, the skin, the past, and that's all they need. Jonathan exhaled slowly. the weight of his own privilege pressing heavy on his chest. He thought of how many times he had walked past David without a glance. How many board members would sneer if this man walked into their meetings? And for the first time in years, Jonathan felt shame. But alongside it, something else sparked. An idea. A dangerous one. "You're wrong," Jonathan said, his voice low, almost a vow. "Doors can be forced open, and I'm going to prove it." David blinked, uncertainty flickering across his calm expression. "Why?" Jonathan leaned back, eyes narrowing with conviction. "Because I need you, David. And whether you believe it or not, this company needs you too." The room went still, the city sprawling endlessly below them. Two men stood at a crossroads, one burdened by power, the other by invisibility, and the air between them thrummed with the possibility that everything was about to change. The following week moved like a current beneath Jonathan's feet. Numbers, meetings, investor calls. Yet in the background of it all was David. Jonathan found himself watching him more closely. The way he carried himself in silence, the way he listened when others spoke, the way he seemed to understand without needing to say much at all. One evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Jonathan summoned David again. This time not to his office, but to the boardroom. The long table stretched beneath fluorescent lights, spotless and waiting. Jonathan placed a stack of documents at the center and gestured for David to sit. David hesitated before lowering himself into the leather chair, his janitor's uniform stark against the boardroom's sterile luxury. Jonathan slid the documents across. "Translate these." David raised a brow. "Into what?" "Mandarin, Spanish, French, whatever you can." David's eyes lingered on him for a moment before he opened the first page. His lips began to move softly, words spilling fluidly, shifting seamlessly between languages as though his mind were a river flowing into many branches. His tone changed with each tongue, firm in Mandarin, warm in Spanish, refined in French. He didn't stumble, not once. Jonathan leaned back, goosebumps prickling his arms. Watching David was like watching a master pianist at work. When David finished, he placed the papers down quietly. "Satisfied?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "More than you know." David looked at him, suspicion in his eyes. "Why are you doing this? You could hire a dozen translators with one phone call. Why me?" Jonathan hesitated. He hadn't expected the question to hit so sharply. "Because they don't have what you have. They speak the words, yes, but you carry them. You know how to connect, to make people feel heard. That's not a skill, David. It's a gift." For the first time, something flickered in David's eyes. Something between disbelief and a fragile, reluctant hope. But before he could reply, the boardroom doors opened. It was Patricia. She froze at the sight of Jonathan and the janitor, seated together at the long table. Her brows knit with confusion. "Sir, is, everything all right?" Jonathan straightened. "Yes, everything is fine. David is assisting me." Patricia glanced at David, then back at Jonathan, her expression tight. She nodded slowly but didn't hide her unease. When the door shut again, David spoke quietly. "You know they won't accept this. A janitor sitting here, working beside you. They'll laugh. Or worse." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Then let them laugh. They laughed at me once too." His eyes burned with a rare fire. "But I don't intend to stop." The conviction in his voice made David pause. He studied Jonathan for a long moment before leaning back in his chair. "If you're serious, Mr. Rains, then you should understand. Once you open this door, you can't close it again." Jonathan leaned forward, his hand pressing against the table. "Then let's open it wide enough that no one dares shut it." The silence between them wasn't empty now. It was alive, charged with a new, unspoken alliance. Two men from opposite worlds, one at the top, one at the bottom, finding common ground on a line that could topple everything if crossed. And outside that boardroom, the company hummed on, unaware that its foundations were already beginning to shift. 2 weeks later, the opportunity came. Larkwell Industries was hosting a high-stakes negotiation with a delegation from overseas, investors from Beijing and Madrid, as well as a French technology partner. Normally, Jonathan would have lined up 3 interpreters, each charging enough to fund a small office for a year. But this time he didn't. When the delegation arrived, the boardroom brimmed with tension. Executives lined the table, suits crisp, pens clicking nervously. Patricia whispered near Jonathan's shoulder, "Sir, the translators haven't arrived. Should I?" "They won't be needed," Jonathan said firmly. Patricia blinked. "Sir?" Jonathan's gaze slid to the far end of the room, where David stood quietly, still in his uniform, hands folded. The board members frowned, some exchanging incredulous glances. A janitor. Here? The meeting began. The Beijing delegate spoke first, Mandarin sharp and deliberate. A hush fell. Every eye turned toward Jonathan, then toward David. And David stepped forward. His voice rose, fluent, confident, weaving the delegate's words into perfect English. There was no hesitation, no awkward pauses, just clarity. The board members leaned forward, stunned. Next, the Madrid investors began, their Spanish laced with urgency. Again, David translated seamlessly, his tone matching theirs, capturing not just the words but the feeling beneath them. Heads around the table nodded in awe. Then came the French partner, her words laced with technical precision. David's French was elegant, smooth, professional. She smiled in relief, remarking in her own language, "Enfin, quelqu'un qui comprend vraiment." Finally, someone who truly understands. Jonathan's chest swelled. He wasn't just watching translation, he was watching connection. Each delegate leaned in more, their posture softening, their trust growing. What could have been three fractured conversations became one unified dialogue. But not everyone was pleased. Across the table, Gerald Whitmore, an old board member with silver hair and colder eyes, leaned toward Patricia, muttering sharply. His voice wasn't low enough to miss. "This is absurd. A janitor at the table? This makes a mockery of us." Jonathan's jaw tightened. His gaze snapped to Gerald. "What makes a mockery, Gerald," he said, his voice like steel, "is pretending we value talent only when it comes wrapped in a suit." The room froze. David continued translating, unflinching, but his eyes flickered briefly toward Jonathan, measuring, surprised. By the time the meeting ended, agreements were drafted, hands shaken, and smiles exchanged. Delegates left remarking on how smooth and productive the negotiation had been. Jonathan shook their hands, pride swelling in his chest. As the doors closed behind the visitors, the board erupted. "This is highly irregular," one snapped. "You embarrassed us," another barked. "A janitor in the boardroom. It undermines everything we stand for." Jonathan raised a hand. His voice cut through the noise. "What we stand for is excellence, and today David delivered it in a way none of you could. You will remember that." The room fell silent, though Gerald's glare burned hotter than ever. When the boardroom emptied, Jonathan turned to David. "You see? The door's open now, and it won't close." David exhaled slowly, his eyes steady but cautious. "Doors open, yes, but every door you open has someone on the other side ready to slam it shut." Jonathan met his gaze. "Then we'll hold it open together." And for the first time, David's lips curved into something faint but undeniable. A smile. The following days at Larkwell buzzed with whispers. Rumors spread like fire through the halls about the janitor who spoke in tongues, who sat at the CEO's side, who'd turned a critical meeting into a triumph. Some employees told the story with admiration, others with disbelief, and some with scorn. But behind closed doors, the board's resentment sharpened. Jonathan received the first blow on a Wednesday morning. Gerald Whitmore stormed into his office, slamming a folder onto his desk. "This ends now," Gerald hissed. "You've humiliated this company. You've jeopardized its reputation, bringing a janitor into high-level negotiations. What's next? Make him CFO?" Jonathan stayed calm, his eyes narrowing. If he has the ability, why not? Gerald's face flushed red. "Don't test me, Jonathan. The board is already circling. Investors are asking questions. If you don't step back, you'll lose more than your pride." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "You mistake me, Gerald. I don't step back when I've found something worth fighting for. And David is worth it." Gerald sneered. "He's a liability. A man with no background, no pedigree, no credibility. You think clients will trust him? You're blind." Jonathan's reply was cold, final. What I see, Gerald, is a man more valuable than half the board combined. The two men locked eyes, the tension between them a wire stretched to breaking. Gerald finally turned, spitting his words like poison. You'll regret this. When the door shut, silence returned. Jonathan exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face. He knew Gerald wasn't bluffing. The board would strike back. That evening, Jonathan found David in the service hallway, pushing his cart. The man looked calm, as though the storm swirling above his head didn't touch him. They're coming for us, Jonathan said quietly. David didn't look surprised. Of course they are, Jonathan frowned. You don't seem worried. David paused, leaning against the cart. When you've already lost everything once, fear doesn't come the same way anymore. They can strip titles, throw insults, close doors, but they can't take what's here. He tapped his temple, then his chest. What I know, who I am. Jonathan stared at him, struck by the depth of his steadiness. For a moment he envied it. All his wealth, his skyscraper, his empire. And still he felt more fragile than the janitor before him. Still, Jonathan said, his tone softening, I won't let them tear this apart. You've given me something I didn't know I'd lost. David tilted his head. And what's that? Jonathan's gaze dropped, voice barely above a whisper. Perspective. Humanity. The words hung between them, heavy, honest. For the first time, David looked away, his mask cracking just slightly. A shadow of grief passed across his face, quick but unmistakable. Jonathan saw it, but didn't press. The truth was clear. This was no longer about business. This was about dignity, belonging, and the fight for a man who refused to be invisible any longer. And Jonathan knew, before long, the battle would explode into the open. It happened on a Friday morning. Jonathan was summoned to an urgent board session. No agenda, no briefing. That alone was unusual, and the way Patricia avoided his eyes as she delivered the notice made Jonathan's stomach tighten. When he entered the boardroom, every seat was filled. Gerald sat at the head of the table opposite Jonathan's chair, a symbolic power play. Folders were neatly stacked in front of each member. The air was thick with anticipation. Jonathan, Gerald began smoothly, his tone dripping with control. We've gathered to address a matter of grave concern. Jonathan sat, folding his hands on the table. Then let's hear it. Gerald opened his folder, sliding out photographs. Grainy shots of David pushing his cart, standing beside Jonathan in the boardroom, speaking before foreign delegates. He spread them across the polished wood like evidence in a trial. This man, Gerald said, tapping a finger hard on David's face, is a liability. He is unvetted, unqualified, and unworthy of representing this company. Yet you've paraded him before our investors like some novelty. His lip curled. A janitor pretending to be a diplomat. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? Murmurs rippled around the table. Jonathan felt a fire rising in his chest. He wasn't pretending, Jonathan shot back. He was succeeding. The negotiations were flawless because of him. You all saw it. A woman at the far end raised her voice. Optics matter, Jonathan. Imagine the headlines. CEO replaces professional interpreters with janitor. Our reputation would be shredded. Gerald leaned back, satisfied. We've voted, Jonathan. Unless you immediately cease this charade and remove David from all professional involvement, we will move for your removal as CEO. The words struck like a blade. Patricia, seated in the corner, looked down at her tablet, her silence screaming louder than anything. Jonathan rose slowly, palms pressing against the table. His voice, when it came, was calm but heavy with iron. You call it a charade. I call it vision. For too long we've measured worth by suits, by titles, by polished resumes. But brilliance doesn't always wear silk. Sometimes it wears a jumpsuit. And if you're too blind to see that, then maybe it isn't me who's unfit to lead. Maybe it's you. The room erupted. Shouts, accusations, fists pounding against wood. Gerald's face turned purple with rage. In the middle of it, the doors opened. David stood there, silent, steady. His gaze swept across the chaos before landing on Jonathan. Their eyes met, and Jonathan saw it. the quiet plea in David's look. Don't destroy yourself for me. But Jonathan's heart was already set. He turned back to the board, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. You want my resignation? Fine. But understand this. You're not just dismissing me, you're dismissing the future. And one day when you're scrambling to understand why the world has passed you by, you'll remember the man you threw away. Silence fell, heavy, unshakable. Gerald smirked coldly. So be it. The gavel struck the table. And just like that, the decision was made. Jonathan Raines, CEO of Larkwell Industries, was out. The boardroom emptied like a battlefield after war. Chairs scraped back, papers shuffled, and one by one the members filed out, avoiding Jonathan's eyes. Gerald lingered only long enough to savor his victory, his smirk a knife twisting with each step he took toward the door. Finally, only two people remained, Jonathan and David. The janitor stood uncertainly by the doorway, his hands gripping the handle of his cart like an anchor. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence was thick, suffocating. Then David stepped forward, voice low. You didn't have to do that. Sacrificing yourself for me, it wasn't worth it. Jonathan shook his head, exhaustion etching lines deep into his face. No, David, you're wrong. It was worth it, because I'd rather lose a title than lose the truth. And the truth is, you belong here, in rooms like this, shaping futures. They can't see it, but I can. David's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, but the words stuck like stones. All he could do was nod. Patricia entered then, hesitant. She looked at Jonathan with guilt flickering in her eyes. Jonathan, I'm sorry, I couldn't fight them all. Gerald had the majority. It was already decided before the meeting even began. Jonathan gave a bitter laugh. Then what was the performance for? To humiliate me. Patricia's gaze dropped. To humiliate him, she said softly, glancing at David. The weight of those words sank like lead. David looked between them, then at the polished floor beneath his worn shoes. Maybe I should just disappear. This is all my fault. Jonathan's hand shot out, gripping David's shoulder firmly. Don't you dare say that. You did nothing wrong. You gave more value in those few days than this entire board has in years. His voice cracked, just slightly. Don't ever diminish yourself because they were too blind to see. For the first time in his life, David, always the invisible man pushing a cart down silent halls, felt seen, truly seen. But outside those walls, the storm had already begun. News of Jonathan's sudden resignation spread like wildfire. Whispers of scandal filled the city. Some called him reckless. Others called him noble. And in the shadows, Gerald moved swiftly, tightening his grip on the company, erasing every trace of David's involvement from the records. Yet, whispers have a way of escaping, and stories, once told, cannot be fully silenced. Because somewhere out there, investors were still asking, who was the janitor who spoke 9 languages and saved the deal of the century? And the answer was about to change everything. Weeks passed. The world outside kept spinning. But inside, both Jonathan and David carried the weight of what had happened. Jonathan was no longer the towering CEO. He was a man stripped bare, learning what it meant to live without the armor of power. David, meanwhile, carried the invisible scar of being the reason for Jonathan's fall, though Jonathan never once blamed him. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. One crisp autumn morning, David was cleaning the marble lobby of Larkwell when a young woman in a sleek navy suit walked in. She wasn't a client, nor a board member. Her badge said Global Alliance Investments. She spotted David instantly, crossing the floor with determined steps. You're David, aren't you? The interpreter. The janitor who saved the Kyoto deal. David froze, mop in hand. Who's asking? The woman smiled faintly. My name is Claire Lou. I was in that room. I saw what you did. She glanced around the lobby, lowering her voice. Word's spreading, David. Quietly, but it's spreading. People know it wasn't Jonathan who saved that deal. It was you. David's brow furrowed. And what good is that? The board erased me. Claire shook her head. Not everywhere. Not with everyone. Some of us don't forget brilliance when we see it. My firm is building a new consortium, one that values ability over pedigree. We want you, David. Not as a janitor, as a negotiator. The mop clattered softly as David let it fall. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He thought of every night spent invisible, every whisper behind his back, every boardroom where doors slammed shut. And now, here was a door opening. Later that evening, David found Jonathan in his modest apartment. Jonathan was hunched over a glass of whiskey, the glow of the city flickering outside his window. When David told him the offer, Jonathan's lips parted, then curved into a weary but genuine smile. "You see," Jonathan murmured. "I told you. They couldn't keep you in the shadows forever." David shook his head. "I wouldn't even be here if not for you. You risked everything. For me." Jonathan's gaze grew distant. "I didn't risk it for you, David. I risked it for the truth. Because a world where men like you are silenced is a world not worth leading." Silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the city. Then David asked quietly, "What about you, Jonathan? What will you do now?" Jonathan took a long breath. "Start over. Build something smaller, something real, without the poison of that board." His eyes softened. "But maybe this time, I won't be building it alone." David's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing through him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't a background figure in someone else's story. He was a man standing at the beginning of his own. And as the two men sat together in that quiet apartment, one fallen CEO, one janitor rising from the shadows, it was clear. The board might have tried to bury them. But what they'd uncovered instead was a partnership that would outlast them all. Because sometimes the most powerful men in the room are not the ones sitting at the head of the table, but the ones no one ever saw coming. If you believe stories like this should be told, hit that subscribe button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below because your voice matters too.